Hey everyone, I hope that you're doing well. I just wanted to check in now that we have finished up Module 1.2. I have a few comments to leave regarding some of the class procedures and also some comments about the histories that we read and that we were discussing. So just want to leave you with that as we start looking ahead to Module 2.1, which many of you have already done. First, just thinking about the discussion board and the expectations. Do remember that when you pose your question about the readings, it should be open ended. Um, that means it can't be answered with a yes or a no or a piece of information, but instead it requires some thought. It requires, or not requires, but it asks for discussion, and you could take a number of different positions on that question. Sometimes you can ask a complex question. It's a pretty good question that actually could be answered with a yes or a no based on the way you phrased it. So just watch out for stuff like that so that you're not doing that sort of thing. Also include context for your questions. So just give us a little bit, not, it doesn't have to be, a whole paragraph, but just some information about, as I was reading Ansaldúa and also reading Ganster, these things came to mind, and so here's my question about XYZ. Again, just to kind of explain and situate what you're thinking about in terms of asking that question to us as a group. And then I wanted to comment on the pacing of our course. The beginning of the course is a bit intense, just to get us up and running on Mastodon, on Medium, and those various platforms. If you're not on Medium yet, please do that as soon as you get a chance. We'll be using that in Module 2.2. And let me know if you have any questions about getting started. Once we start Module 2.1, which the first day of that was today, and many of you have already started a little ahead of schedule, at this point, the first week, the point one module, we'll be doing our first pass through the book, and that's when you'll post to Mastodon, and that's when you'll do a discussion board, much like the one that we just completed. And then the second week, 2.2, 3.2, and so on, that second week you'll focus on your blog post, and that's what you'll write and add to Medium, and you'll be able to read one another's posts and comment on those. But that's all you'll do during the second week. So the first week, again, you'll be kind of getting into the book and doing those questions and those comments and thinking about authors' methodologies. During the second week, it'll be a second pass through the book, and you'll be thinking more in terms of the history that the authors described. And of course, those talking about borders, there aren't hard and fast lines. We're going to overlap between those two things. First week we'll end up talking about the histories. Second week we'll talk about methods still too. But that's just sort of how things are set up, so that as we work through the books, we'll have a focus and you know what to plan for. In terms of the readings that I gave you for 1.2, it was meant to be kind of a cross-section of different ways that scholars, cultural commentators, and journalists all think about borders. So many of you commented on Orsi. He's a historian. He was doing a state of the field essay. So here's what borderlands historians have been doing for a long time. Here are some of the gaps that I'm still seeing and what hopefully scholars in this field of borderlands history will start to do in terms of giving us kind of a big overarching picture of the history of the borderlands rather than just individual stories. Ganster, also academic, but comes at the border from a more social science, so using a lot more quantitative data to look at trends and the histories of the borderlands. Marshall is a journalist, and his was a much bigger view, not just of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, but worldwide borders and what it means that even in an era of globalization, people are putting up walls and nationalism is on the rise and those kinds of trends and issues. And then Ansaldúa is a Chicana feminist, as many of you pointed out, who has personal lived experience with the borderlands and who's working within that tradition of Chicana and Chicano studies coming out of the 1960s, 1970s, which continues to be an important field today. But it's one that can be based it is an academic field, so I don't want to make it sound like it's not an academic field, but it's one that uses cultural commentary and people's lived experiences and oral histories, film, pop culture production as its site of investigation. So it's like an interdisciplinary field that will look at archives, will look at histories, but also takes these other things into account to understand a person's lived experience and what being a borderlander or a fronteriza really means. So again, these are very different approaches. And that's what I was hoping that you would get a sense of. And as we leave this module, something that many of you are talking about is this question of bias. And as I pointed out on the discussion board, I am one who believes that as researchers and authors, we can't ever escape our biases. I think it's a good sign when an author lets you know where they're coming from. I think Ansaldúa does that without being explicit about it. And of course, many of you did additional research into Orsi and Ganster to kind of figure out their backgrounds and what they might be bringing to the table. That's all important in figuring out, where might this person's bias be. And then we have the issue of interpretation. And so when an author is presenting us with a narrative, whether it's kind of a strict academic study, whether it's making an argument, whether it's telling a story, whatever it might be, that author is making choices and is using a certain set of sources or maybe certain sets of sources and interpreting those sources to tell us the story or make the argument. And that's what we need to figure out in terms of methodology. How is this person situating themselves relative to this topic? And how are they interpreting and viewing these sources? Are there other ways that they might interpret these sources and tell us a different story? Is that just because of their focus, or is it because they only have this one story to tell? When we're thinking about an author's argument, we want to think about whether the book itself is argument-driven or source-driven. And what I mean by that, are they using the sources to lead them to a conclusion or to an argument? Or, other way around, do they have an argument in mind, seemingly, and they're trying to interpret and adjust the sources to fit that argument? I think that latter example is more of what we're talking about when we use the word bias, although sometimes when we talk about an author's biases, we can confuse that with interpretation. So that's something I want you to think about. Are we talking about an author having a bias, or is this just their interpretive framework and the way that they're thinking about and helping us make sense of these sources? And why does that distinction matter? So I look forward to getting into Alice Baumgartner's book with you all. As I mentioned in some of the other materials, I do know her personally, and she's a great scholar, great person, and so I'm really excited to see what you think of her work. And that said, don't hesitate to be critical of it, because that's what scholarship is for. That's what these books are for, and that's what we're working to do. All right, I hope you're having a good week, and I'll talk to you all soon.